not me just getting my actual essay ready to speak to you. It may or may not be 3 pages long, is all I'm going to say, but it's a rather large font. These are my notes for what I'm going to talk about today. So hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is the Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light review video. So you may recall that a couple of months ago I did a Wolf Hall reaction to the trailer. I watched the trailer, kind of gave my thoughts, what I was expecting, what I was hoping to see in the series, and then the show started being released and they were releasing 1 episode a week. So I wanted to wait until all the episodes were out so I could watch the whole thing, and then I would do a review. Basically, it had been so long that I decided that I would rewatch season 1, then watch season 2, and then what I thought we would do in this video is I will give you a very, very quick rundown of the books and the world and how everything works, mainly in terms of dates, because it does cover quite a long period of the books and the TV show. And then I thought we would do a season 1 recap, very quickly, kind of my thoughts, how it appeared, how it felt, the kind of vibe of it in 2015, and then we'll look at season 2. And then I'm going to do a very tiny bit at the end where I talk about books versus TV adaptations and what I think is better. So that's going to be the format. I'm going to try and keep this succinct, but you all know me. You all know what I'm like. I'm a little bit of a talker. So without further ado, let me get my essay ready and let us jump into the Wolf Hall review video. The kind of world of Wolf Hall covers 15 years in total, from when the very first book was published in 2009 all the way up to where we are now in 2024. Here's a quick rundown of when things were released and how the books and the TV shows kind of fit into the whole canon of the Wolf Hall universe. I say universe like it's a Marvel thing, but you know what I mean. So Wolf Hall the book came out in 2009. That's the very first thing that was released. The books are by Hilary Mantel, and Wolf Hall the book came out in 2009 and it actually won the Booker Prize for fiction in the same year. Then 3 years later, in 2012, Bring Up the Bodies, which was the sequel, book 2, came out in 2012, and that also won the Booker Prize in the same year in 2012. Then, in 2015, season 1 of Wolf Hall came out, and it was a BBC adaptation over 6 parts, and it starred Claire Foy, Mark Rylance, Damian Lewis, and a host of other actors. And then in 2020, Hilary Mantel published The Mirror and the Light, which was the 3rd in the series of books. Now, this didn't win a Booker Prize, but it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2020. And then skip forward another 4 years and we've got season 2 of Wolf Hall, which is called The Mirror and the Light. So you'll notice there that season 2 isn't called Bring Up the Bodies. So there was Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, The Mirror and the Light. And as far as the TV show goes, we've gone from Wolf Hall all the way to Mirror and the Light. But the TV shows do cover the events that happen in Bring Up the Bodies. So even though Bring Up the Bodies as a title hasn't been used anywhere, the content of that book is still covered over season 1 and season 2 of Wolf Hall. And just for clarity, I'm going to just refer to it as Wolf Hall season 1, Wolf Hall season 2. So that's the kind of world and how we've been kind of developing these books and series over the last 10 to 15 years. Let's move on to the season 1 recap. So like I said, I wanted to rewatch it. It had been years since I'd watched season 1, and I don't think I actually ever finished it. I think I got about 3 or 4 episodes through and then for whatever reason didn't finish the series. So I definitely wanted to watch it all the way through, and I wanted to recap it so that I could do a more clear side-by-side comparison of the 2 seasons. So I've divided this into 2 sections, kind of my overall thoughts. These are thoughts that came up that regard that kind of season as a whole, and then I'll go on and I'll do some specific moments in the show that I liked, and those will relate to specific episodes or specific things that happen. But in the overall thoughts, one of the biggest things that struck me when I was rewatching season 1 was the use of light and how they used natural light like daylight, or the lack of natural light, how they used darkness and really played on that kind of darkness, gloomy situation. They used candlelight, like actual real candlelight, not a little flame with then a fake big light, studio light somewhere behind, you could tell that a lot of it was candlelight. Or if it wasn't actually candlelight, they did a really, really good job of making it look like that room was only lit by candlelight. They definitely do use real flames and real candles and real lanterns and things, because we see scenes where Cromwell blows a candle out, or he'll nip a candle out with his fingers, or they use I call it a putter outer. That's what they're called. What have they got? Extinguisher, a candle extinguisher. I have one in the back of the scene right here. Would you like to see it? This is not in my script, by the way. This is my very medieval, not medieval, putter outer or candle extinguisher. So you would have a candle, it lit. Imagine this is a flickering candle, and you would just do this. And basically you put it over, and the lack of oxygen within it puts the candle out. So you see them dousing candles with an extinguisher and other things throughout the show. So they're definitely using natural light, using candlelight. But yeah, if they are using any other studio lighting, then it's so subtle that it leads you to believe that that room, that scene, is only being lit by either natural light or by the candlelight. And I thought that was superb, because it really added to the atmosphere. It's using the location, using the light almost as another character to kind of develop the feeling and the atmosphere and the tension of a scene. The other thing that I thought was brilliant for the same reasons is the use of music. So they didn't use soundtrack in the way of kind of just ambient music in the background, which a lot of modern shows and modern films do. It kind of was completely absent for most of the scene, and then there'd be something would happen, or there'd be a point made, or a character would do something dramatic, and there'd just be almost like a sting of music. But it was always in season 1 especially, always early modern music. You could tell that they were using real period instruments. I think it's like the very early modern versions of what would become our modern pianos. You can hear those, you can hear the strings played quite a lot, and I think flutes and lutes were used quite a lot. You can just tell it had a real ambience of, this is kind of the sound of music that you would hear in the time. So like the fact of just having early modern music in the early modern period is just, yeah, lovely. Really, really nice to see. And it adds that extra layer of historical kind of depth to the show. And like I say, it was great for adding tension, for building, for creating that bit of drama, because the show in and of itself is quite muted in terms of drama. It's very understated. It's very nuanced. That's one of the things personally that I absolutely loved about it in season 1 and season 2. Absolutely outstanding, the fact that it isn't overly dramatised, and they use all these different dramatic techniques of lighting and music and scene to really add the drama that you don't necessarily need in the plot or the character. I thought that the use of costumes and props were just done so beautifully. I was a little bit concerned in the trailer that the costumes wouldn't be great. There were a couple of times and I was like, that looks a little bit on the cheap side. But for the most part, the costumes were beautiful. The ruffles, the collar, the black work on the shirts was absolutely beautiful. And even the ladies in lots of different costumes had different types of shirts and their kind of undershirts showing a little bit, and the corseting, and you could tell that the kind of the panels on the front of the dresses were pinned in. There was even a scene right at the end of season 2 where one of the characters is being pinned into her dress, and I was like, yes, that's exactly how it would be. So it felt very almost as close as you can get in terms of a dramatic reconstruction in terms of costumes. I thought it was very, very good. I still didn't like Henry's feathered cap. Those feathers may be completely genuine, they may be real feathers, they just didn't look in it, and I don't know why, but something about his hat bothered me. Loved Cromwell's hat, his with the little ear things, I don't know what they're called, the little ear covers, and then the hat that sat over the top of the cap. Beautiful. I thought that was really lovely, and the hat really, you can tell that the hat is a symbol of status and taking it off as a mark of respect and putting it back on again. Absolutely brilliant. I thought that the dialogue was brilliant in the show. I just think that the use of dialogue, or the use not of dialogue. I mean, there's so much nuance and acting going on in Mark Rylance's face as Cromwell. The way that he can convey meaning and story and drama just in an expression or a lack of expression. It's absolutely masterful, and it's no surprise really that Mark Rylance won a BAFTA for his role as Cromwell in season 1 of Wolf Hall, because he is just unbelievable. His acting is superb, and I know that so many people wanted him for Shardlake, and he would have been too old for Shardlake even back in 2015 when the first season of Wolf Hall was filmed. But I would have loved back then a BBC adaptation of like one of the Shardlakes where he was Matthew Shardlake, because even though he would have been too old, he's just exactly how I imagine Matthew Shardlake to be. Yeah, I thought that his portrayal of Cromwell, his use of character, of how the dialogue that he does say, it's pithy, it's there's these instances of humour, there's, you know, everything is measured and controlled in season 1, especially in the early episodes. And I'm going to get onto this a little bit more in a minute when I talk about his kind of character development. But just the way that it's been scripted, and it may be like this in the book. I'm going to come on to talk about the books shortly. There may not be massive amounts of scripting in the book either. But it's just, they're not telling through dialogue. They're showing through light, through sound, through scripting, through characterisation of the face, through place. All of these things are coming together to tell a story, and it's just lovely. Absolutely lovely. So as I've said, the casting I think was perfect for this. The three main characters in season 1, Damian Lewis as King Henry VIII, Mark Rylance as Cromwell, and Claire Foy as Anne Boleyn, are just... I nearly did chef's kiss then. But I've been trying to stop chef's kissing in my videos. But honestly, they were just perfect. I can't think of a better Anne Boleyn than Claire Foy. She just plays her role perfectly. Claire Foy's got this ability to stare someone down in a way that makes you cold to the bone. And it was one of the things that made her play Queen Elizabeth so brilliantly in The Crown. But she's got the same, this kind of, she can be sweet and innocent and vulnerable as Anne Boleyn, but she can also harden her features and become this hard, dangerous, don't mess with me Anne Boleyn. Again, just absolutely perfect. And as I've mentioned, Mark Rylance as Cromwell is just superb. But Damian Lewis as well as Henry VIII. In my mind, when I picture Henry VIII in my mind, I always picture Damian Lewis, because he's just exactly as I would see Henry VIII. You know, he's got the colouring, he's got the red hair, he's got the beard, he's got the kind of the facial structure, but his acting is just so much like Henry VIII as well. I'm going to say something really controversial now. I kind of liked the Tudors version of Henry. Who was it? I can't remember his name now. Jonathan something, who played Henry VIII. It was completely off the wall because he didn't look anything like that, didn't Henry VIII? But I kind of liked it, that they played on the kind of the sex symbol of Henry VIII, whereas this one is a lot more kind of traditional. It sticks with the portraits that we have existing of Henry. It's more our kind of common accepted view of Henry VIII, and I liked that, and I liked that Damian Lewis was able to do the vulnerable Henry, but also the anger and the level of rage that Henry VIII historically got to. Damian Lewis just absolutely knocked it out of the park. He knew exactly how to convey that level of rage and to make himself bigger, metaphorically, not physically. Of course, obviously Henry VIII does get a lot bigger in real life, but to make himself metaphorically bigger in a room and his voice bigger and his intimidation bigger was just absolutely masterful acting. So, getting on to a few specific things that I really loved about season 1. Oh no, sorry. I need to come back to the final thing, which is an overall thing that I absolutely loved. They filmed on location. Yes. How many times do I have to say in a period drama review, please just film on location. Do not film in a set. And they didn't for season 1. I'm not so sure about season 2, but I'm going to come on to talk about that in a minute. But season 1, they filmed on location, and they found all of the, basically I think they found every single Tudor building and Elizabethan building they could in England and filmed in it. Because there are so many recognisable places. but it's just beautiful and it just made it come alive. Now, there is I was talking to Kayla, my friend and fellow historian, about this, and we were talking about the fact that obviously in the Tudor period, these buildings wouldn't have looked old, they wouldn't have looked dated, the stone wouldn't have been weathered and this, that and the other. But the thing is, even if a show decided that they were going to completely rebuild a Tudor manor out of stone and out of wood and rebuild it perfectly as it would have been built in the Tudor period, and then filmed in it, I don't think that we as the audience would see it in the same way, because in our mind's eye, if I tell you, picture Henry VIII's palace, picture a Tudor palace, in your mind's eye, 9 out of 10 of you will think of a Tudor palace as they look today. A little bit weathered, a little bit old, the stones kind of weathered away a bit. It looks an old building. And so if they then did this fully recreated, all the stone is sharp and brand new and it's not dirty and it's not marked or anything, you'd go, oh, no, don't like that. It doesn't feel Tudor. So even though the historical accuracy of those buildings, they wouldn't have looked as weathered in the time period itself as they do on the TV show, I think it helps with the kind of cinematic psychology for the viewer to watch it and go, okay, yes, this is, in my mind, this is the accepted Tudor period. This looks historically correct. I can fall into this. I can be immersed in this because it looks how my brain expects it to look. Does that make sense, or am I just rambling? I don't know. Let's get on to some specific thoughts instead. One of the things that I really noticed about Cromwell's character is how they kind of use his vulnerability to tell a story. So when his wife and his children die in season 1, which is so sad and beautifully kind of done, beautifully executed, that scene of little Grace in her wings wandering down the corridor with the candle, the foreshadowing in this show is unbelievable. And when he sees his wife's ghost temporarily kind of stood at the top of the stairs, again, foreshadowing, fantastic. But he doesn't cry. He doesn't cry when his wife and daughters die, but he does cry when when Wolsey dies. And there's a scene where his tears are literally running down his face as he finds out about Wolsey's death. And so it was a really interesting kind of character statement there. It's not using words, it's not using it, it's literally using tears to convey the fact that Cromwell was able to shutter away his emotions when it came to his own wife and children. But when it came to Wolsey, there was some weakness, there was some kind of vulnerability, there was something about this man that broke him almost emotionally. And I think it's because Thomas Wolsey, was his name Thomas Wolsey? Yeah, Wolsey, I'll just call him Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey. He lifted Thomas Cromwell up, he elevated him, he put him in the position that enabled him to then rise through the court. And it shows how much Cromwell values that elevation in status, and that his emotional ties to his family, yeah, he was devastated when his family died, obviously, but not broken to the point of tears. And I thought that was such an interesting point in the show. I also loved that they had a repetition of the same memory in season 1. So there's a point where Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell are walking through a garden together, and Thomas More's got this white rabbit, Thomas Cromwell, and they're walking in the garden together, and Thomas Cromwell tries to tell Thomas More that he remembered him when he was a teenager and they were at Lambeth Palace together, and that he served Thomas More. So Thomas Cromwell was a waiter, in effect a server in the hall, and he served More. And More doesn't even let Cromwell finish speaking. He talks over him, he dismisses the kind of memories of, I don't remember that, and walks off. And it's one of those moments where it's a real slap in the face to Cromwell, a reminder to Cromwell of his own kind of low status. But then there's a repetition of this memory again later on in the season, where Thomas More is actually in prison in the Tower of London, and Cromwell goes to see him either to interrogate him or to talk to him, and he repeats the same memory, and he says, you know, I served you once when we were at Lambeth and you were a guest at dinner, and I served you wine and this, that and the other. And it's the way that Thomas More, he tries to dismiss it again. He says, you know that I don't remember this. But Cromwell he's able to finish the memory, he's able to say it to him, and I think it's a real beautiful way of showing through the kind of scene how the tables have turned, the power has changed. So when he first tried to say the memory, More was very dismissive. The power was very much in More's court. Whereas when it gets to the end of the scene and at the end of the show, and Cromwell is retelling this story, he's the one that stands above Thomas More, and he's the one that's commanding the conversation. He's like, no, you will listen to me in this memory. This is not about you, this memory. This memory is about me, and I'm telling you this, and you will listen to me. Oh. So yeah, I thought that was such an interesting idea. The idea of having the same memory or the same moment repeated in two separate periods or two separate parts of a show or two separate parts of a book. I'd be really interested actually to know if that repetition of the memory is in the book. I don't know if you've read the book, let me know if it is, because I think that's a really interesting narrative technique to be able to show a shift in power and a shift in in status. So one of my absolute favourite things is the development of Thomas Cromwell's character throughout season 1, and I think this is obviously the main kind of focus of all 3 books and of the series in general, is this kind of development of Cromwell's character, and it's just absolutely beautiful. It's beautifully acted, it's beautifully scripted, and there's a few little moments where, you know, at the beginning of the show, he's very measured. Every single, even his thoughts almost feel calculated, and his expressions and what he says and what he doesn't say, everything is so thought through, and you can almost see him repeating it in his mind before he speaks it out loud. Whereas as we go through the series, there's this slow reduction in control, this slow degradation of his self-control, to the point that he's shouting at other people, or he's snapping, or he's being more commanding of other people, where he was quite subservient in the beginning. So there's a point where he's talking to one of the lords, and they start to talk, and he says, "Don't interrupt me." And it's the first time that we've heard him raise his voice in the whole series, and it was one of those, it shocked me to hear it, and I think that's the whole point. You're supposed to be shocked at him raising his voice, but it just shows this kind of slow degrading of his control, like I say, an erosion of his self-control, and I thought that was really beautifully scripted. There's also a line where, when they're trying to basically indict Anne Boleyn for adultery, they're trying to prove that she's been adulterous against the king and has slept with her brother and all this different kind of stuff, and there's a line where Cromwell says, "I need guilty men." And it makes you realise that, because up till now, it makes you realise that he's willing to put his morals to one side in order to get done what he wants to get done. And I think the thing is, because up till now, we've kind of been thinking that Cromwell is working to do what is right. He's constantly wanting to do the right thing. That's the kind of characterisation that you feel is being given. And then that's the moment where you start to think, oh, okay, he's willing to put other people or get rid of other people in order to get what he wants, or to advance himself, or to revenge Cardinal Wolsey. It's a realisation that actually there's a much darker side to Cromwell, and he's crossing a line, and how willing is he to cross that line. And actually the interesting thing about Cromwell's character is he quite willingly steps over that line. You know, he's not dragged over it. He's not given no option. You know, he's quite complicit in the fact that he found guilty men in order to get rid of Anne Boleyn so that the king could marry again. And I thought that was so clever. Again, a simple line, "I need guilty men," that conveys so much more meaning. So the last couple of things that I really wanted to mention were kind of right at the end of the season, and it's when Anne is being beheaded, her execution scene. And I thought that the first beautiful moment was the fact that when she stood up onto the kind of execution platform and she gives her final speech, she's speaking them out loud, and they don't mic her up. And I nearly did chef's kiss again. I'm probably going to chef's kiss at some point before the end of this video, let's be honest. It was just perfect, because this is the thing. You see these shows and you see these big scenes, and there's somebody stood on a stage here and there's like 1,000 people out, and you think, why does that sound like that voice is being projected? That is not how it would happen. And having her unmiked was such a small moment, but it just added so much legitimacy to the scene. And another point of it is kind of because somebody in the crowd says, "We can't hear her, she needs to speak up." But it's more than that for me. It's the fact that it makes it feel like it's actually happening a lot more than if her voice was crisp and clear and projected, because it's mic'd up. Absolutely brilliant, brilliant scene. And then the way that the beheading happens, it just... I mean, I've watched a lot of Tudor shows, so I've watched a lot of beheading, not actual beheading, but like a lot of recreated beheading and treason scenes and this, that and the other. And I don't know, there was just something about the way that this one was done. There's a moment where Claire Foy, as Anne Boleyn, puts her hand up and she's kind of like playing with this bit of hair. And I was thinking, in my mind, before I even like had chance to stop the thought, I was like, oh, put your hand down. What, you're going to get your hand, what are you doing? And at the same time, Cromwell says, put your hand down, put your hand down. And it just instantly mirrored what I was thinking at the same time. And it just showed her vulnerability, her nerves, how terrified she was in that moment. And it's just beautifully directed as a scene. And then we obviously see the way that the sword is used to take Anne's head off. But then the aftermath, the way that her female attendants pick up her head and pick up her body, and they're covered in blood, and the horror of it is conveyed without actually really showing much gore at all. The only gory bits you see are the blood on people's hands. And it's such a beautiful symbol, because there's blood on more hands than just the women who are physically covered in blood. Oh, it's so nuanced and beautiful. I could talk about it forever. I really could. I feel like I'm making such a whistle-stop point of this, but it probably feels like I'm wittering on, but for me, I feel like I'm only just touching the surface of how much I could talk about how superb this show is. So, final judgment, and this is what I've written here. No notes, it's just perfect. Which is not quite perfect, but it's almost. And I think it's got to be one of the top 5 period dramas I have ever seen. I know, I'm putting it out there. It's one of my top 5. And that includes season 2 as well. So spoiler alert, I thought season 2 was great as well. So let's go on to season 2. My microphone says I've already been recording for 32 minutes and I'm supposed to be making this video 30 minutes in total. It's not going to happen, is it? Right, let's get on to season 2. So, I finished season 2 last night. We are on Monday the 16th of December, and I finished watching it on Sunday the 15th, because I actually think the last episode only came out yesterday. So I watched the last episode and this is all fresh in my mind. So let's get into it. I've done it in the same way as I did season 1. I've got some overall thoughts about this series as a whole, and then I've got a couple of specific points I want to point out. Specific moments that I want to raise, point out, have a look at, discuss, etc. The first thing to note is something that was very obvious right from the very beginning, is that they've had to do some cast changes. Now, that's to be expected. The original Wolf Hall was filmed in 2015. We're now in 2024. It's 15 years. There's bound to be... No, it's not 15 years, is it? No, it's 9 years. Is it 9 years? Yeah, 9 years. Nearly a decade. There's bound to be some reasons why some of the original cast cannot come back and reprise their roles for season 2. I think the biggest disappointment for a lot of people was the fact that Tom Holland was not coming back, which I have to say, I think it would have been nice for Tom Holland to reprise that role. I mean, you know, you've got other big actors that came back into their roles, like Thomas Brodie Sangster, who was absolutely fantastic as Rafe in season 1, and he came back for season 2, and he's a big actor now. Maybe not quite Tom Holland level, but he's big enough to be commanding quite large sums for his roles, and I love the fact that he came back to do it, and same would have been great to see Tom Holland in that role. However, he could also have been too big as a face for the character of Gregory. Gregory's supposed to be a bit of a wishy-washy, you hardly really notice he's there. He's got very little screen time in season 2, so maybe we didn't really need Tom Holland. The guy who has replaced Tom Holland as Gregory is fantastic. And Dudley Dursley is in it, who is just an absolutely fantastic actor. I can't remember the actor's name now, but he is just absolutely fantastic. Obviously it was Dudley Dursley in Harry Potter, and then he played Edgar Allan Poe and created one of the best lines in all cinematic history. And he's like, "Books! You have never interested me more." I just love that scene. Absolutely brilliant. I think about that meme on a regular basis. Anytime anyone says books, I always go, "Books," in my head. So he's just brilliant, and he's really proving to himself that he can become an actor away and above what he did as a child or as a young adult. And I just think that his roles are so interesting. So he plays the character of Risley. And then finally, the redhead. So when I was watching the trailer, there was a redheaded actor, and I said, oh, I think that might be Princess Elizabeth. Now, Princess Elizabeth in this is obviously supposed to be an infant, because it all kind of happens within kind of like 2 or 3 years of, well, certainly in season 2, it all kind of happens in a few years of her being born. So I didn't quite compute that in my head when I was watching the trailer. It turns out that it's actually Lady Mary, or Queen Mary the First, as she will become later in history. And the actor is Lilith Lesser, is her name, and she is the daughter of Anton Lesser, who plays Thomas More in Wolf Hall as well. So that was really lovely. I hadn't seen her in anything else, but she was absolutely fantastic. She played Mary really, really well. And I think I really liked the Mary from the Tudors, the actor who played Mary in the Tudors. I thought she was a fantastic Mary. For all of the weird casting of the Tudors and how it just was obviously very not historically accurate at all, I actually thought that her casting in the Tudors was brilliant. And I was kind of, Sarah something her name is, can't remember what her second name is. I thought she was going to take some beating, but actually I thought that Lilith Lesser did a really, really good job as Mary. So one of the other things I really loved is the fact that they used quite a lot of the original footage from season 1 in season 2. And I wonder if this was in order to kind of like colour match, and I mean, it's just geniusly done. They've managed to take, so in that very, very first scene of season 2 where they're recapping Anne Boleyn's beheading execution scene, it's mixed in, there's mixed in footage with Cromwell and Gregory in the crowd, and it's almost like a soft launch of Gregory, because it's like it's the same scene, but it's showing very clearly that the actor has changed, so it's a bit like a Gregory soft launch, but then it's mixed in with footage from the original series. Like there are the bits where Claire Foy as Anne is kneeling and she's preparing, and those bits and the bit where she's actually executed, those are all from season 1. But then the scenes where Cromwell is with Gregory in the crowd, those have been reshot, but they do the same things. There's a scene in a bit in that scene in season 1 where Cromwell grabs Gregory by the arm, and in season 1 we see it from the side, and in season 2 when we're recapping it we see it front on, so we see him grab him from the front, and it's little details and it's nuanced, but it's really beautifully done. But all the colour matching and the grading, and I don't really know enough about how you do that. I don't have enough of that knowledge, but I know enough to know that it's been matched really well so that you can hardly tell. The only reason I knew that some of the scenes were original is because I'd literally just finished that bit of season 1, and so I knew that it was exactly the same because I'd literally only just seen it. It's a sign of how you can do these things right, and this is something that has made me and Kayla really sad when we think back about Shardlake, the Disney adaptation of Shardlake, because the Wolf Hall adaptations just show how it can be done well. And I wish we'd have had the Wolf Hall treatment and the Wolf Hall scripting and the Wolf Hall everything that makes Wolf Hall so amazing. I wish we'd had that with Shardlake. So yeah, I think the more that you see something like Wolf Hall and you see how brilliantly it was done, it makes you realise how some other things were not maybe as greatly done as you thought. And the episode recaps. So there's 6 episodes in each season, and I have to say it took me until episode 4 in season 2 for me to realise that they were doing episode recaps through memory. It was genius. So at the beginning of every single episode, Cromwell is sat in bed, or he's writing a letter, or he's sat looking at the fire or something, and he's having this memory of what had happened the day before, or a horrific event that had happened. And it's always it's a recap of what had happened in the previous episode, but it's so cleverly done. You don't realise it's a recap. You know, it's not previously on Wolf Hall, which does my head in for a period drama. You don't need a previously on Shardlake. It just breaks the fourth wall immediately. And I've been watching a bit of The Last Kingdom, and they do it on The Last Kingdom, but what's his name? Uhtred. Uhtred does it as if he's saying it. So he's like, I did this and I went here and I spoke to this person, this, that and the other. But it's still previously on The Last Kingdom. All they had to do in that was literally have Uhtred writing a letter since my last letter, this has happened. Then he says it all as if these things have happened. I'll write again soon. That's all they had to do in that situation to make the recap immersive, to have it not break the fourth wall. So for them to have thought about that to that level and that extent, to create memory at the beginning of the episode, to recap what had happened previously, it makes me so nerdily excited. I honestly, I can feel my whole body being excited about it. It's just, yes, you've tried and you've made an effort and you've really tried to think about these things, about how to make these things part of the show that are necessary, but just beautifully done at the same time. So I think they definitely still filmed a lot on location, 99% of everything was done on location. I thought that was great. There were a couple of times when I was looking and I was thinking, are they in front of a green screen there? And I don't know whether there was maybe some issues with filming where, they could only get access to, I don't know, say Hampton Court Palace courtyard for 2 days of filming. So one of the things they did is they just filmed a backdrop scene, and then they're doing green screen and having the actors stood in front of a green screen of previously filmed footage of a location, because there were a couple of times when I just could almost see a perfect outline. You'll know what I mean if you've ever seen green screen done before. It's impossible, virtually impossible, to get rid of that kind of slightly wavy perfect outline of people. And there were a couple of times when I saw that and I thought, I'm not sure about that. I could be wrong, and I'm not going to say it as a judgment. I'm not going to take anything away from it, because there could be a very legitimate reason why they had to do it. But it just slightly broke my immersion ever so slightly. And the last thing that I will say, which is an overall thought, which did slightly break the immersion, was the fact that I did notice a couple of times that Mark Rylance was wearing quite heavy makeup. There were a couple of times when I could just see that kind of almost cakiness on Mark Rylance's cheek. It was mostly on his cheeks, kind of here, that you could see it at times. But again, I'm not going to hold anything against them because they did everything else so great that I can get over a little bit of makeup, Let's get on to some specific moments that I liked. So I love, again, the nuance in Cromwell's character throughout this particular season. And it's funny because in season 1, he started out being this humble, quiet son of a blacksmith, very much kind of in touch with his origins. And throughout season 1, he elevates and he becomes more influential, more powerful. He becomes more egotistical. He becomes more aware of his power. As I said, he's snapping at people. He's losing that bit of control. And season 2 starts at that point and gets worse. He gets more egotistical. He gets more aware of his power. He believes himself untouchable. And yet there's also this increase in his vulnerability and his fragility throughout it as well. And I just thought all of that was so beautifully nuanced. And again, Mark Rylance's acting was absolutely superb. And I think there were a couple of real standout moments, is that they were both in episode 1 actually, which I think was the whole point, kind of setting the bar of this is where Cromwell's at, is that at one point he physically moves a man out of his way. I can't remember what's happening in the scene, but he physically moves him. And you think, God, Cromwell of season 1, episode 1 would never. And that's the point, is the point that he's now getting to the point that he feels like he can physically move someone who, in terms of, social standing, even though Cromwell is now on a par with them, because he comes from, kind of poor, impoverished, working class backgrounds, all of the men in the Lords and in the Privy Council and in the court would have still seen him as lesser. And that's said all the way through, he's called Wolsey's dog, he's called the butcher's dog, he's called the blacksmith's son. They never fail to remind him of where he came from. And so for him to feel confident enough to physically pick a man up and move him out of the way, it just shows how he regards himself now amongst these people. And it's almost like he's looking down on them because he considers himself to be superior in many ways. There's a lot more politics in season 2. There's a lot more kind of scenes around the Privy Council table, and I'm sure that some people will maybe think that those scenes were boring. I thought they were absolutely fantastic because it's so nice to see the politics side of the Tudor story. We see so much the romance and the sex and the drama and the beheadings and the births and the deaths and all that kind of stuff. We very rarely see the politics and the kind of the loss of control of government and the council over the king. And I thought that the Privy Council scenes were so great at showing that. And just generally the kind of setup of the scene, the way that the room is constructed, all the Privy Councillors sat on the table and then Henry VIII raised up on the dais on his kind of throne, was just brilliant. I mean, he would have been up on a platform anyway with Henry VIII, so it's historically accurate, but also it's so great cinematically because it shows him, it makes him bigger, even though he is physically bigger, it makes him metaphorically bigger. It sets him above everybody else cinematically as well as actually and politically, and it's just, yeah, it's just a beautiful way of adding that extra tension and power and intimidation from Damian Lewis as Henry VIII. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I thought that the dialogue at these moments when they're kind of all talking over each other, and there's an episode where Ambassador Chapuis, I think it's Chapuis, yeah, and Thomas Cromwell are sitting in a tower up at, I think, Thomas Cromwell's house, and there's a thunderstorm going on. And it's a little bit on the nose because it uses the thunder to emphasise the points that Thomas Cromwell's making. So it's a bit on the nose in terms of using it as a dramatic technique, but I loved it. I thought it was like a really interesting filming technique to do. So basically they're having this conversation and it's all very dramatic, and Cromwell's trying to have this kind of make these points, and then there's flashes of lightning and crashes of thunder, and it's using nature rather than music to make a dramatic point, to heighten the tension in that scene. And I thought that was really, really interesting and a really different way to use sound as well as light in terms of commanding how we react to that scene and how we react to it. And it's not even just like it happens, but it's not referenced, because at one point Chapuis says, what kind of man sits in a tower in a thunderstorm? And then later on in the conversation he says something like, you knew that this thunderstorm was going to happen, didn't you? Or something like that. So they make reference to it as well. It's not just used as something cinematically, it's used as part of the storyline as well as the cinematic. It's just great. It's just great. I feel like I'm nerding out hard on this video, and maybe I should be a bit more balanced in terms of things that I didn't like, but there's not really that much to say. So I'm just going to be nerdy and you're just going to have to deal with it. Like, if all period dramas could be like this, I wouldn't moan as much. I wouldn't have to moan. I could just be nerdy on all of my videos. Oh God, I forgot there was all of this left to do. Right, we are going to try and get through this fast because, like I say, I am losing the light. One thing that I didn't like is I didn't like that they made Jane Seymour out to be stupid. They made her out to be almost like she didn't understand etiquette, she didn't understand societal expectations, she didn't know how to behave in certain situations. Like, as the Queen, she didn't know that she should go first into a room, and I thought, come on, I know she's supposed to be naive and sheltered, but she has also been brought up to be at court and to be part of the kind of very highest echelons of British society, of English society. She would know how to do these things. So it felt a little bit unfortunate. I felt like Jane Seymour's character felt a bit flat in comparison to some of the other characters that were a lot more nuanced. So that was a little bit of a shame. But at the same time, it's not really about the wives. And I love that. I love that we're seeing a story that is about Henry VIII's wives that doesn't just focus on the women. Because we do find that quite a lot in the Tudors, in things like The Other Boleyn Girl. It's always about Anne Boleyn, and it's never about the kind of the male side of the politics. And a lot of people say, we don't need to see another male version, we don't need to see history through another male gaze, but actually it doesn't feel masculine. Cromwell doesn't feel overly masculine at all, actually, throughout the whole show. I think he feels very in touch with his feminine side in some ways. He's most vulnerable around women. He's able to be honest around women, and women are his weakness. Whether that's familial or romantically, they are his weakness, and they're where he shows his vulnerability. So it doesn't feel like an overly masculine portrayal of Tudor England at all. So yeah, I thought that was really, really a bit of unfortunate that Jane Seymour was portrayed in that way, but also I understand that really the wives aren't the focus here. I think the scene in the garden as well, where Cromwell's talking about the fact that he made Catherine of Aragon, the promise to look after Mary, is really interesting, not because of the content of what he's saying, but the fact that he's saying that means that he's feeling comfortable. He's getting reckless with what he's saying, and he's almost like he feels like he's above judgment, he's above reproach. He can say whatever he wants and he's untouchable. And all of the men around that table go, why are you saying this? Shut up. They're almost like, don't say that, because that makes me culpable now from what you've said. And I thought that was another really interesting moment. It kind of shows, and he's laughing through it. Cromwell's laughing. He's arrogant in that scene. He's very much like, nobody can touch me, it's fine. And it's foreshadowing. Again, the foreshadowing is strong at that point, because you're like, ooh, this is going to come back to bite him on the arse. So I did like, actually, that in season 2, there were a couple of very small moments of humour. The poetry scene where they are questioning, is it the Duke of Norfolk, about his bad poetry? Absolutely genius. No, it's not the Duke of Norfolk. I can't think who it is. Oh, it's De La Pole, isn't it? One of the Poles. And they're talking about his poetry, and it was just...
I do not know if I read this verse. You forgot it, as any man of sense would, but in the 5th stanza there, you write, pardon me, your man, Tom Truth, which you rhyme, unfortunately, with growth.
Even I know better, and I'm French.
I thought that was brilliant, because it's like, it wasn't out and out funny, but it added a bit of humour, and it just, I liked the wittiness of it. I liked the fact that Cromwell has this witty side to him, sarcastic and almost taking the piss. And again, he's the son of a blacksmith, and yet he's at the point that he feels that he can make fun out of men like the Poles, who actually had some claim to the throne. You know, they are like royalty, like members of the royal family, and yet he is belittling them in what he's saying to them. And again, it just shows how his character's developing. And again, another example of his interaction with women. I thought the addition of his daughter Yenneker. By this point in Cromwell's career, everybody in England knows who he is. Everybody's judging him. Everybody's watching what he's doing. He's very, very observed and monitored. Whereas Yenneker's character, she comes in and she's a complete blank slate. So he can be vulnerable. He can be honest. He can be himself with her. And I think it allows us a chink through that armour into the true Cromwell, or is it the true Cromwell? That's the question. That's the way that we're meant to think about it. But it's really interesting. It shows that slight vulnerability. And I love the fact that it is what he's saying about Launde Abbey to Yenneker is the thing that he comes back to right at the end when he's executed, is he's talking about going to Launde Abbey, and it's talking about that kind of honest, that true self that pokes through, that he comes back to right at the end when he's killed. So 2 points and then I will stop. I loved the fact that as we get into the second half of the season, there is this complete loss of control of Henry VIII. And I love the fact that it shows how Cromwell and the members of the Privy Council created Henry as this beast, this man who can create the world and the England and the wives and the marriage and the life that he wants. And there's nobody to control him, because they've placed him as the head of the church. They've placed him as the head of England. He is anointed by God. He is answerable only to God. And they've all enabled him to be there. And then they can't control him, because how do you control someone who has no accountability to anybody but God? It's so interesting, just politically and historically, the personage that Henry VIII became in his latter life is just so remarkable in terms of psychology and all of that kind of development of him as a person. And it's funny that even at that point, Cromwell still believes that he can control Henry. So actually what he's saying, Cromwell is saying that he's above Henry. He thinks he's smarter than Henry. He thinks that he can outmaneuver anything that Henry throws at him. And actually what he's saying there is that he thinks that he's higher than a king, and that Cromwell himself is answerable only to God. And it's such an interesting kind of concept when you start to think of it in that way. And I love the fact that that kind of arrogance it's subtle, but it's there all the way through the latter scenes, and there's chaos, and it's just the momentum, the kind of action, in a way, it gets more and more fevered all the way through up to episode 5. And then you have this calm of episode 6. Episode 6 is such a quiet episode. This is the final episode. It is so quiet. Cromwell doesn't speak much at all. There's the scene where he's being interrogated, and I think that's very pithy. There's very witty dialogue, and I love the way that Cromwell says, "Oh, well, it was my purple robe. She couldn't resist." Even then, the sarcasm and the funny, and he's ridiculing these men that are coming to indict him for treason, and it's just beautifully scripted. But then after that time, it's very quiet and it's very contemplative, and I think that's done on purpose, because I think the whole point is that by this point, Henry is beheading people on a whim almost. You don't do what he wants, you don't deliver what he asks for, and he will literally off with your head. And I think that's kind of how they've chosen to portray this, is that it all happened over the space of like a month in reality, from like June to July. He was arrested for treason and then killed. And the way that they show this happening in the show is that it's not dramatic. It is literally, the king wants rid of this man. The king got rid of this man. And that's it. There's no high drama treason scene where they're in a judge in a courtroom and, you know, Cromwell's fighting for his life and this, that and the other. There's a quiet acceptance. There is I mean, I could unpick that last half of that episode so deeply, but the scenes where he is sat in the same room that Anne Boleyn was in when she was arrested at the Tower as well, he's in the same room. I don't know if that was historically accurate, but I thought it was a beautiful piece of symbolism for the show. And he's seeing his son and he's saying goodbye to everybody. He sees Rafe and Rafe cries, and it's so simple, and it's almost more harrowing and it's almost more horrifying in its simplicity, because that's the truth of how Henry treated people. He was horrifying in how simply he got rid of people. He just ended lives anytime he didn't like anybody anymore. Anytime somebody offended him, he just got rid of them. But he didn't just get rid of them and banish them, he killed them. You know, these people were all killed because one tyrannical man had decided that he didn't like that person anymore. So I think that's the kind of symbolism that was in that end of the episode, and I loved how they handled his execution right at the end of episode 6. The very last thing that happens in the show is his execution, and they don't show his beheading. They show him walking to the block, they show him putting his head on the block, and there was an opportunity for them to hugely sensationalise Cromwell's death, because there's been a rumour that has gone, you know, I don't say gone around, there's been a rumour for centuries since this happened that the executioner struggled to get his head off, and that they hacked at him and hacked at him and hacked at him and struggled to get his head off his shoulders. And they could have gone down that if they wanted to sensationalise it and create drama and create gore and a bit of, you know, to shock the audience, and they didn't do any of that. He came out to the block, he put his head down, and then you see these shots of him at Lawn Abbey, and he's recalling the peace and the tranquility, and that's it. It stops with him looking back over his shoulder, and it's very peaceful in the end. And I think it's an interesting choice to have that peace at the end of the show. So yeah, I thought that was an absolutely fantastic end to the season. So again, overall thoughts were that it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, and yeah, I just absolutely loved it, and I will be rewatching it again and again. I think it's one of those shows actually that probably the more you watch it, the more you pick up. So thank you, whoever created it. All the team, I say whoever created it, there is obviously a team of script writers and directors and, you know, costumiers and makeup artists and all those different type of people, the prop makers, the location scouts, the set dressers, all of those people who go to make that. Thank you so much for creating such a beautiful period drama, because honestly, these are the period dramas that people deserve and the ones that we don't get quite nearly often enough. Right. I was going to do a chat about the TV show versus the book versus an audiobook, and I think that I have waffled on for quite long enough. I have been very open before about the fact that I've struggled to read the books. I haven't had time to go back and try again in light of watching the show it's pre-Christmas, everything's a little bit mad. I do want to go back, I've got Bring Up the Bodies here in my bookcase, and I do want to have a go at listening to the audiobook of Wolf Hall, and I might come back to this whole, I'm planning a video for the new year around reading and different kind of ways that people engage with reading. Don't want to really talk about it too much here, but I am going to save that part of this video, the kind of discussion around books versus TV shows versus audiobooks, for that video. If you have stayed this far and you have got this far, what shall we have as our emoji? What can we have? Let's have a skull. Yeah, let's have a skull, because somebody was painted, there's a painting in the National Gallery, and it's got a skull, and the person is pointing at the skull. I'll put the painting up here. And it's one of those paintings that the skull has been painted in a certain way so that it becomes 3D depending on how you stand and look at the painting. It's a beautiful painting. It's probably one of my favourite paintings. I think it might be a Holbein, actually, because Holbein features in Wolf Hall as well, and he's a great character in his little cameos that he makes. So yeah, let's put a skull in the emoji, and we can all be reminded of our own mortality and how we interact with the world. Yeah, so if you've watched this far, thank you very much. And yeah, if you've watched this far and you're not already subscribed to my channel, please do consider subscribing. I do videos around books, period dramas, writing. I'm a writer myself. I've written 2 non-fiction books about women's history, and I am closing in on the end of my first draft for my first historical fiction novel. So I do talk about my writing process, and I do a little bit of travel. If I do any book events, I will vlog those. I do a little bit of lifestyle vlogging every now and again. So yeah, if you want to know more about me, about what I do, and you want to follow along on my kind of writing, reading and period drama journey, then do consider subscribing. And yeah, I'm going to go and I suppose I should start the edit of this, really. Fun. How do I get an over an hour video down to 30 minutes? I don't know, but you know what? That is a problem for future Charlotte, and it's not your problem, because by now, by the time you got to this point, I will have done all the hard editing and you will have watched the video. So thank you again. Have a very Merry Christmas. I mean, I am going to be putting out more videos before Christmas, but if you don't watch any more of my videos, I hope you have a fantastic week. Like I say, it's going out pre-Christmas, so I'm going to say Merry Christmas, even though it then dates my video. But yeah, thank you again for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.